Thank you also, Sean, for the opportunity to talk about some of these new maps of Egypt in the Duke Library's collection, which I hope some of those here today with us will be able to look at themselves and to talk about those in relation to a piece of my own research. So my focus today, and I'm just going to say this right up front, is going to be mostly on the interwar period, but I want to start in the present. So back in November of 2021, I was at one of my favorite places in Cairo, the Egyptian Geographical Society on Osdolani Street. It's right downtown. It's inside the security perimeter of the Upper House of Parliament, so it often takes some pleading to get in, not a lot of visitors. There's also an ethnographic museum attached, much of whose contents come from sub-Saharan Africa and hark back to 19th century Egyptian imperialism that gave birth to this institution. Anyway, on this particular visit, an employee walked my friend and me through the museum, identifying each of the artifacts. Finally, the docent stopped to unlock a room that was lined with shelves of rare old maps, antiques. For a fee, he said, copies of these maps could actually be burned onto a CD. Great. But then he leaned in and whispered rather admonishingly to us, but not all of them. Did you know that there are maps here in this collection that could cause a political crisis? Now, the docent was afraid, he said, that by sharing a map with the wrong people, he might inadvertently undermine national security. In 2016, as some of you might remember who follow Egyptian news, maps were in fact at the center of a high-profile court case there, a case that involved control of the two tiny Red Sea islands, Tiran and Sonafir. When President Sisi announced the sale of islands to Saudi Arabia that year, pent-up rage toward the military regime poured out through this rare valve of permissible opposition, and a legal challenge to the deal was allowed to proceed in court. During this period, some said state institutions had received orders to destroy maps that undermined the government's case, while at the same time, the regime touted the opposition's reliance on old maps that it had found in archives in London and Berlin to argue its case, its own case, as evidence that the opposition had colluded with imperialist agents to, again, undermine national security. So I give these examples. One is personal, another is an anecdotal, another a well-known national event to underscore the power that maps wield in Egyptian political culture today. Now, I'm sure it comes as a surprise to no one here at all that maps are political, but the degree of sensitivity and suspicion that surrounds them in Egypt today is something that I think it's worth pausing at before we step back into the past. As I said, my focus is on the interwar period, on the 1920s and 30s. This is both because that's the period that the maps now in the Duke Library's collection date to, but also, and crucially, because the interwar era, these years are really essential to understanding how maps became and remain, I believe, so sensitive today. So I'm going to be talking about how the political landscape of interwar Egypt shaped the production of knowledge. That's the overarching kind of umbrella, but specifically the production and dissemination of geographical knowledge, in this case through maps. So before I dig into that, I'd like to say the interwar period in Egypt is identified with a number of different things that, in fact, do have a relationship to map making. One being sort of the golden age of travel, tourism, Egyptology, a certain vogue for desert adventure, infrastructural expansion, but it's also a period, and all of these things, as I said, are related to mapping, as well as intelligence gathering, of course, in advance of the Second World War, some of which would take place in Egypt. But this was also a period of intense suspicion, resentment, distrust, and uncertainty within the organs of government. And mapping, the maps we're going to be talking about today are officially produced maps. So I want us to keep this in mind as I give a little bit more context, because this is where I want to land today. And I want to talk about the relationship between the dynamics of distrust and suspicion and the maps that were produced in Egypt during this period. Okay, so Maps with all sorts of, now we can finally look at some maps. Maps with all sorts of intentions, shapes, looks, aesthetic, etc., of course, have been made in and of Egypt for a very long time. This, many of you may be familiar with, is a map, part of the Kitab-i Bahriya by Piri-Reis, the Ottoman geographer and cartographer, navigator from the 16th century. It's actually quite easy map to read if you're able to see closely. I will say, unfortunately, with Zoom, it's going to be challenging to see the details of these maps. So if anyone would like me at the end of the presentation to return to any map and try to zoom in, I'm happy to do that. We have, of course, much later on the left-hand side here, one of the maps that was produced as part of the Description de l'Égypte, the massive kind of information gathering project, Napoleon's deputies. And then we have on the right a map from the 1870 specifically, that was produced for Khedive Ismail by a cartographer named John Manuel. I know this is really hard to see on Zoom, and I apologize for that. It's a really high resolution map, actually, and I'm happy to look at it in more detail with you later. This is a map that shows the sources of the White Nile and its affluents, and this was the large swath of Africa where the Khedive's government hoped to extend Egyptian economic and political influence. This was actually one of the maps I asked about at the Geographical Society in 2021 when I was warned about the political impact of maps. So this is from 1870. So maps did not circulate widely in the 19th century. I think it's worth saying that, of course, but interested members of the public could find and purchase them, some of them. So this, I think, is a really interesting ad. This in 1844, a lithographic printer, Penasson, advertised in Arabic in Al-Ahram, the newspaper, that copies of an official military map of operations in Sudan's Kordofan region were for sale in his shops in Cairo and Alexandria, or could be delivered to the buyer for an extra price, for an extra cost. So that's kind of an interesting precursor to the maps we're going to be talking about today. So in 1898, the Survey of Egypt was established. And this is the institution that produced the maps that Duke Libraries has acquired. And that is the predecessor, it's the same institution that still exists and still produces official maps in Egypt today. If you've ever been to Midan al-Masaha in Doi in Giza, that is the Masaha of the Maslahat al-Masaha, or the Survey Authority of Egypt. So this was 1898, as I said, 16 years after the beginning of the British occupation of Egypt in 1882. And a British Army engineer and self-taught geologist named Henry George Lyons was appointed to head the survey. This new department united geological, hydrological, and cadastral projects that were already underway, and it declared even greater ambitions. Most importantly, it relied on triangulation, the method that surveyors and cartographers in Europe had been using since the late 18th century, the Carte de France, some of you may be familiar with, and that the British East India Company and then the Raj government in India had deployed across India beginning in 1802, a project that took about 70 years in India. The idea here, and Matthew Edney has written about this quite a bit in the Carte de France, the idea here was that the mapping of an entire land area, specifically the land area of a nation, could be carried out using a single technical process. And this is what more or less the Survey Authority in Egypt set out to do. Its first major undertaking was I'm trying to switch my slides here, was a countrywide cadastral survey, which was completed in 1907. Now, again, while I say countrywide, and it was theoretically countrywide, its purpose was to reconnoiter cultivable land for taxation and land disputes. So while it was in progress, the survey authority moved from under the aegis of the Ministry of Public Works over to the Ministry of Finance, and this reinforced that link between mapping and taxation. This is probably not especially surprising to anyone here. But who used these cadastral maps besides the Finance Ministry? Well, in 1908, the survey distributed, according to its count, roughly 82,000 maps to various government agencies and sold about 18,000 maps to the public. It's a little hard to break that down. We don't really know who bought them, but of course, literacy rates were quite low. But the head of the survey, H.G. Lyons, believed that expanding small landowners' access to his survey's maps was key to enforcing a uniform system of private property registration and to resolving property disputes. So while these maps were not primarily intended for village landowners, of course, much less the peasants who worked that land, the survey's map distribution campaign deputized a stratum of the public in its project of state making and suggested to people that they would benefit somehow from adopting the government's kind of cartographic vernacular. We also see around this time how maps were spreading from specialized offices in the government to schools, and also were used to a greater extent in everyday transactions. So in addition to maps that were produced for learned societies and government departments, they were distributed to local inspectorates, and they were produced specifically for schools beginning in 1909, as well as for banks that required clients who wanted their land to serve as loan collateral for documenting ownership. So I think it's really important when we think about the history of information and the dissemination of maps within the history of information to think about how maps were used or not used, as the case may be, or how people who made them hoped that they would be used, as well as what the maps themselves actually looked like. And I will talk about that a little bit more soon. So while mapping was certainly not new in 1898, of course, when the survey was established, what changed with the establishment of this institution, the Survey of Egypt, was a matter of scope, of methodology, and of duration or permanence. Also, as Timothy Mitchell has argued in his essay on the Great Land Map, it was also a matter of the reconfiguration of expertise in a central office in the capital. So the survey authority saw mapping as a vast but a finite, ultimately discrete work in progress, a collective and comprehensive project. With time, the idea was all of Egypt at every scale could and would be mapped. In its 1909 annual report, in fact, the survey announced that it was finally on the verge of completing the cadastral mapping of all agricultural land, and it had done some degree of reconnoitering in the rest of the country. More on this rest in just a moment. So I'm going to step back again just a little bit and tell a story that then will intersect with the one where I've left you. So in 1891, a German geographer named Albrecht Penck had an idea. A uniform map of the entire world with agreed upon metrics and symbols on a scale of 1 to 1 million, where each unit on the map would be 1/millionth of the land it represents, right, when we're talking about scale. So the International Million Map, as it was called, depended heavily on British government backing, since this is, of course, the heyday of the British Empire. Full 25% of the proposed map sheets would depict places that would be mapped by British cartographers. So in 1909, representatives from 10 countries met in London to kick off that project. Now, Egypt, incidentally, was which was under, of course, British occupation still, was one of the places where Penck's dream was going to come up short. Specifically, it was going to be the desert that foiled it. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that in 1909, the same year that the International Million Map project was kicked off, the Survey of Egypt said that it was on the verge of reconnoitering the rest of the country. Well, this rest, of course, is the desert, which is a huge, it's 3/4 of Egypt's land area, but a very small percentage of its population. So there was the British surveyor and cartographer who was in charge of desert mapping, and we'll see him in a moment in a photograph, was a man named John Ball. And he began mapping the deserts of Egypt, began surveying the deserts of Egypt at the turn of the 20th century. He was already involved in this when the Million Map officially kicked off. And this really motivated him to keep this project going. But he discovered that even the project of mapping all of Egypt on a single common scale was not as close to reality as it had appeared merely a few years earlier. He said there were vast areas without a single observation for altitude, while existing data were open to errors of a magnitude intolerable for even a preliminary contouring. So mapping Egypt's deserts to a degree of exactitude that satisfied the mostly British surveyors was to prove a persistent problem. And overcoming the Million Map disappointment set an agenda for the survey for years to come. Then came World War I. Now, during the first decade of the 20th century, the survey authorities' ambitions had been directed inward. Its cartographers wanted to know what was inside Egypt's borders, even as sections of those borders actually remained quite fuzzy. And I recommend Matthew Ellis's book about the demarcation of the Egyptian-Libyan border for more on that topic. But the First World War crystallized a broader imperial vision that linked the unfinished task of mapping Egypt to Palestine, to Syria, to Transjordan and Iraq, and saw the management of smugglers, nomads, geology, and development as related challenges that were directly correlated to the resilience of British rule. And because Egypt's survey department was established, in fact, both people and equipment was sent to Palestine and to Iraq in particular during the war. And basically the institution was deputized to map other parts of the region that were critical to the war effort and to intelligence. In Egypt itself, during World War I, Egypt's civilian institutions fused with military ones, and many British officials changed their suits for uniforms. The established presence of these men across so much of the government made it easier to redirect activities toward the war effort. And by December 1914, Britain had also commandeered the throne, declaring a protectorate. Now, the plans were made to trim down the auxiliary machinery of war once the guns went silent. And this was an interruption that left many branches of government ripe for reorganization. In 1918, in the aftermath of the peace, civilian institutions were slowly reconstituted. But the outbreak of revolution in March of 1919, the Egyptian Revolution, interrupted this process, and it also exposed significant gaps or blind spots in British officials' control of information. So this sets the stage now for the meat of what I want to talk about today, which is the interwar years, as I said. Cartography was a part of the process by which institutions that were charged with gathering information, such as surveyors working with the mapping authority, and producing knowledge, generating maps and disseminating maps, reconstituted themselves in these tense years that followed the First World War and the 1919 revolution. Sorry, I just got to take a sip of water. So in 1922, just after the war, after the revolution, Britain unilaterally declared Egypt independent. But as we know, there were major caveats in this. And it was a stillborn sort of independence that left not only plenty of British soldiers, diplomats, and professionals, but also a lot of tension, uncertainty, and profound resentments in its wake. British and Egyptian officials continued to work side by side with these resentments simmering for another 30 years, right, until the early 1950s. these interwar years are crucial because they saw the British gradually and grudgingly handing over the day-to-day operations of government and semi-governmental agencies, including the reins of the Survey Authority. In the meantime, the mutual distrust, as I said, between British and Egyptians pervaded the organs of state and shaped the production of knowledge. Now, plenty of colonial officials saw relinquishing oversight of everyday affairs as something rather tolerable, even a relief. But losing a grip on the collection and dissemination of information, be it news, rumors, intelligence, statistics, or coordinates, was really unacceptable. The solution they found was to create sub-offices that were nested within established departments of government, and these remained British as Egyptians took over more and more posts, effectively barricading units of colonial administration and expertise within the state. This was certainly true in the Ministry of Interior. It's not the focus of today's talk, but I have written about it. But an important parallel to what happened in the Ministry of Interior was what happened at the Survey Authority, at Maslahat al-Masaha, the unit charged with mapping the country. Now, I want to get back to my slideshow here. Sorry, I want to skip ahead actually to show something quickly here. Now, I have there are two ads, two notices from the newspaper on this slide. On the left, we have an announcement from Al-Ahram noting that Egyptians are replacing foreigners in high-ranking positions in government, including the survey. This is from May 8th, 1924. And on the right, we have an ad also in Al-Ahram, September 1st, 1923, for an employee entrance exam for the Survey Authority. This is specifically for Egyptian citizens. So both through announcements like this, through news items, we can chart what British officials certainly wrote about quite extensively in their own accounts of the period, and I mean mapping officials. That the post-1919, post-revolution period marked this gradual, as I said, and grudging handover of power, but one that was uncomfortable for everybody involved. Egyptians certainly felt it was not happening fast enough, and the British officials who remained in Egypt were highly distrustful, and certainly kept secrets from the colleagues with whom they worked side by side. So with this in mind, I want to take a look at some of the maps that were produced during this period that are now in the Duke Library's collection. And then I want to shift to talking about some of what is not visible on those maps, and yet helps give us a fuller picture, and that will entail a return to the desert. So here we go. So as Sean mentioned at the beginning of the hour, Duke has acquired a number of these maps from the series. This one is printed in 1928, but based on surveying that was done in the early 1920s from the country of Egypt, El Qutr al-Misri. This is Komombo from Upper Egypt, the southern part of the country, and it's sheet 1678. Now, you frequently, when you look at all of these maps, there's always an indication of the sheet number. And these numbers refer to the distance of the sheet from the origin point from which the map, from which the surveyors began triangulation. So adjacent sheets, you move basically along the adjacent sheets will have adjacent numbering. And this can help you figure out where things fit in the larger picture. So this is the series. These are folding maps on a scale of 1 to 100,000. They were for sale. There are prices listed in each of the maps. I'm going to look at the interior here. Again, I would love to look at I hope that everyone will, if you're in the Duke area, you'll go and look at these in person so you can see them up close because they're incredibly detailed. But this is more or less what the maps look like. And this aesthetic remained consistent from the maps produced in the early 20th century through, and I'll show you a more recent map, basically more or less through today. Here we have, this is part of the same map. This is the bottom half of the map from Komombo. You can see here Marquez Aswan, sort of in the middle of the map there, and the key down below. So if we look in the key, as I said, this is a map on a scale of 1 to 100,000. Below the scale, we can see the sheet number again, 16/78. And then we can see what the adjacent sheets would be within the same series. The one below is 12/78, the one above 20/78. So the categories of things represented on these maps, of course, we have municipal and other administrative boundaries. We have the railroad, really important if you're taking a train down from Cairo to see the sites in Upper Egypt. All sorts of roads and other infrastructure, namely water, bridges, aqueducts, etc. Indication of which land is cultivated or cultivable, as well as touristic points of interest, which appear on several of these maps. Now, I think it's important to also talk about the technical, briefly, this is not my area of expertise, with full disclosure on this, but the technical processes by which these maps were produced. In particular, to break down that process. Generally, and this is based, my analysis here, my version of this is based on notes that were often preceded the books in which these maps were, similar maps were published. These are just folding pocket maps, but the mapmakers, the British mapmakers, did write quite a bit about their process. So remember, there's a process of gridding, of surveying, of field sketching, of then inking, and then printing, and then reprinting. And this occurs at over and over again. It's an iterative process at different scales, adding points of triangulation to create what the mapmakers saw as more exact or precise maps. So I give that as just a background. I think it's important to remember that this was happening over and over again, and that these pencil sketches were inked in the field where possible. That saved money. Otherwise, they would be taken and redrawn back at the headquarters in Giza. These maps are paper, but they also indicate that you can buy a paper version or linen-backed paper for something a little bit more durable for a little bit more money. As well, these are also useful to some extent for tourists visiting, as I said, the ancient sites, the pharaonic sites in Upper Egypt. And some of the maps in the Duke collection are specifically marked as such, that they are intended for the suyah, to the tourists, to facilitate their knowledge of the excavations, particularly around the Valley of the Kings. And that's the Gorna map that Sean alluded to. But as I said, there's something here that you've probably noticed here, which is that most of this map is in fact white, that it appears blank. And that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my work on maps in Egypt during the interwar period. So if we look here, this is an index map. This index map is included in the folding pocket maps, like the one that I just displayed. And an index map shows the complete set of sheets, of map sheets that exist within a given series. So here we have this is the Fihris, the index, as it says, of sheets within this 1 to 100 series of El-Qutr al-Misri. So what I find particularly kind of interesting about the index map, of course, is that you see the shape of Egypt that in a way that sort of does not align with what the borders of the country are. These do not, where the places that are mapped are not synonymous with the political borders of the country. They're synonymous. They match, of course, the populated, highly populated, and cultivable parts of the country. But what about what is going on outside of those spaces? Basically, what exists in the negative space of the map out here on either side of the index. So this is what I want to come to now. And as I said, what I've spent a lot of time thinking about, which is the history of the Desert Survey of Egypt. Now, the Desert Survey was an innovation, was established in 1920 and was dissolved into the larger survey authority again with the coming of World War II. So it really is a product of the interwar period, more or less exclusively. As I mentioned earlier, there were efforts to reconnoiter, to survey the deserts that extend east and west from the Nile Valley, beginning by the Survey Authority or its affiliates, beginning at the turn of the 20th century. But after World War I, there was a concerted effort to try to fill in the gaps, the vast gaps. So here we have an example of another, it's basically contemporaneous with the maps we've just seen of Komombo. But this one is of Siwa Oasis in the Western Desert. And the map itself dates to 1930. Now we look at this map and, what do you notice? Well, it's almost entirely white. When we think about mapping, in this period, we need to talk about, as I said, what is both seen and what is unseen. And here, this is a map. It fits onto it's a different series, but it is nevertheless a map of what was yet to be fully mapped. And so I bring this up because here, I want to straightforward here. Here's a photograph of the Desert Survey, the folks who were charged with mapping these vast expanses. So what did this have to do? What did these people, and what does this map I just showed you have to do with the politics of this period? Oops, sorry, I'm trying to put another image here. So as I said, this was a period of intense uncertainty, of tension over the replacement by Egyptian officials of British ones, and also a period in which the intelligence apparatus, the British intelligence apparatus of Egypt, was increasingly concerned about intelligence threats coming from the desert. Now, at the start of World War I in 1914, British Army officials had noticed that, quote, the only properly mapped part of the desert was the northern half of the Sinai Peninsula. As I noted, though, these during the war, the British authorities came to see the deserts as an increasingly strategic part, or increasingly saw the deserts as part of the strategic linked strategic zone connecting Egypt with Palestine, Iraq, and so forth. So in 1927, the first Egyptian surveyor general was appointed, Hussein. Sorry, these are slightly out of order. Hussein Pasha. Now, you may be familiar with his name because he later served as prime minister briefly 3 times, but he was the first non-British surveyor general of Egypt. And so again, part of the, he's an example of the shifting tide from British to Egyptian management of the institution. But the British surveyors who worked for the Survey Authority were unwilling to let go of the desert and of their own control over the mapping of it. So, sorry. So they formed the Desert Survey, as I said, in 1920. And one straightforward way that they did this and maintained control was by denigrating Egyptian employees' training and expertise. Survey work, even more than intelligence gathering, they said, was a vocation and not merely a job. They had a profound aversion to relinquishing their monopoly on this type of scientific expertise, and also a keen sense of their own irreplaceability. As an example, John Ball, the head of the survey, again, we can come back to this image here. He's down here in the white suit, third from the left in the front row. He writes to the Royal Geographical Society president, A.R. Hinks, in London, from Maadi in Cairo in 1930. And he says the following: "I shall try to keep our little show going and my little band of British surveyors at work in the deserts, but I am not sure of success, as it has been said that Egyptians could do it equally well, and we are therefore superfluous. Of course, we could go cheerfully if we think that the work could really be done by Egyptians, but I have used Egyptian effendis in the desert and I know them. Here and there you can find one really interested in his work, but 999 out of 1,000 think only of promotion and pay. And you can't manage intrigue when you are hundreds of miles out in the wilderness." So while others disparage Egyptians' level of training, Ball was saying something else. Not only that they didn't know how to do the work British experts were doing, but that they did not want to know. And specifically that they did not want to know about the desert. If they did, it was for reasons that were crassly utilitarian by British standards. So thus, even as survey officials were wringing their hands over Egyptian disinterest in their work, however, we actually see moments in the interwar period when Egyptians seized on the value of the Desert Survey's projects that British surveyors dismissed as fanciful. So for example, John Ball, the surveyor here we have in the front row, translated an opinion piece from a Siyasa newspaper in 1927 that was titled "A Naval Base in the Desert." In this article, an unnamed author compliments Ball's own work to bring water to the Qattara Depression, which was one of the projects for which he pursued the mapping, again, of the Western Desert. Ball, however, forwarded this article to London, ridiculing the author's conclusion that the project might yield a safe harbor for a future Mediterranean fleet of the Egyptian Navy. So again, not having the proper expertise was an issue that might be resolved by more training. But the British cast the fundamental issue as one of indifference, of not wanting to know, or of wanting to know only for the wrong and illogical reasons. And in making this argument repeatedly over and over again, the Desert Survey officials like Ball implied that even providing more training would not close the gap. Consequently, colonial officials reasoned the Desert Survey was a project that they had to see through to completion. The question of retaining personnel, of expertise, dovetailed with colonial survey officials' commitment to seeing through the shading of those empty expanses on the map grid. That we can come back to this image for that. In 1950, this is after the dissolution of the Desert Survey, and just before the Free Officers' Coup of 1952, the last survey director, George Murray, again, still a Brit, writes that when the survey commenced its work, the reproach might well have been uttered that more was known of the topography of the moon, half of which had been properly photographed, than that of Egypt, 9/10 of whose map bore the legend unsurveyed. And indeed, we see that on this map. I know it's not very visible. This fraction, however, was even smaller for the Western Desert. Yet there's a certain swagger still in the survey's reports from this period, even when they were expounding on the work still to be done. In fact, Murray continued in this 1950 retrospective. He said the next 50 years will be a period of change, and we may confidently expect that by 1998, the area of unsurveyed Egypt will have shrunk to a vanishing point. The confidence that emanated from Murray's reports found visual expression in the thousands of nearly blank map sheets that the Desert Survey printed in the 1920s and 30s, like this one. But at the same time, this quantification fueled colonial officials' confidence in the unknown. Apologies. Director John Ball in 1924 had told the members of the Cairo Scientific Society about the survey's progress in mapping these unknown regions, providing them with the following list of statistics. He said that the Egyptian-Libyan desert, that's the Western Desert, constituted more than 3/4 of the Egyptian kingdom. Less than 5% had been surveyed on a triangulation basis, 25% reconnoitered, and the unexplored area of the Libyan desert in Egypt alone reached 546,000 square kilometers, or more than half the area of the country and more than the whole area of France. He wrote at the time that these numbers elicited gasps from the audience, but he was reveling in a sense of how relatively little had been accomplished. By quantifying the still unknown, he articulated a new lacuna that he and his unit were waiting and, in his opinion, uniquely qualified to fill. Yet, by the time the free officers' coup in 1952, George Murray, again Ball's successor, wrote that still only 43% of Egypt had been professionally surveyed, 24% was roughly known from reconnaissance, and 33% was still unknown, all of which remained in the far Western Desert. So to reiterate, before I come to a conclusion, ultimately survey authorities in tandem with the Frontier Districts Administration, which was the political administrative body of the deserts, articulated a position that held certain kinds of not knowing to be acceptable, even desirable, and that's the British kind, and others, the Egyptian kind, to signal ignorance and apathy. So what were the consequences? What were the consequences? I want to leave that hanging for just a moment. To say that the unilateral declaration of Egypt's independence in February 1922 had been a chimeric milestone, and it marked the start of a troubled and incomplete process of disentanglement between Britain and Egypt. The British, who remained in the country after 1922, continually suspected that enemies, foreign and domestic, were encroaching on the empire's security and in turn on their own. At the same time, they feared relinquishing control over the production of knowledge. So both Ministry of Interior and survey officials were keenly aware of their impending departure, though they were uncertain how long it would be before they actually left. Compartmentalizing information, for example, retaining control over the Desert Survey, even as the survey as a whole changed to Egyptian hands, for more than 20 years, allowed them to continue what they were doing, albeit with increasing roadblocks. Yet it also deepened resentment and suspicion among government employees, planting seeds that proved difficult to uproot. While British mapmakers seemed to embrace the unknown with secure exuberance, they feared what the wrong hands might do with it. The consequent culture of concealment only deepened Egyptians' resentment that their counterparts' priorities were driven by an imperial vision that they did not share and to which they explicitly were not made privy. So the institutional changes that accompanied Egypt's de jure independence in 1922 did not mark an end to the information warfare that was corroding public trust. Secret keeping became even more entrenched in the apparatus of the state itself. Now, before I conclude, I want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, that in fact, the aesthetics of the maps have not changed immensely in the decades since. And this is a map of the Harga Oasis in the Western Desert that was produced in 2003. Based, as it indicates, on aerial images made in the 1990s. This, interestingly enough, is a map made by the Military Survey Authority, Maslahat al-Sahel Askariya. The Western Desert governance are run by military governors. But this is a map that's intended for use in archaeological excavations, which is why I have a copy of it. Otherwise, of course, military maps are incredibly hard to come by. Now, interest in the desert itself did not disappear with the British surveyors who were so eager to chart it, of course. Egyptian investment in desert research and development served to repudiate the projection of apathy and ignorance that had surfaced repeatedly through the interwar years. And in 1950, the Fuad, the first Desert Institute, was inaugurated. It still exists today as the Desert Research Center in Mapmaking in Cairo, with the mandate of studying the makeup of the arid lands. Meanwhile, the constant demographic pressure on the Nile Valley placed the deserts at the center of the development dreams of the Nasser era. And these aspirations have continued in the decades since. In the meantime, the desert acquired a darker reputation with the opening in 1956 of the Oasis prison, Sijn al-Wahat, which has often held political prisoners. So, why have maps remained so sensitive in the post-colonial era? I'm interested in hearing your own thoughts as I conclude here now. But I will say that vast spaces of the nation still reside primarily in foreign archives, at the UK National Archives, at the Royal Geographical Society in London, at the Institut Français de l'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, etc. So as I've tried to show today in this brief introduction, the obfuscation that drives us to these archives abroad is not just a product of contemporary authoritarian politics. It too has a history of its own. This projection of ignorance and of apathy left a scar and an anxiety which I think can only be read through its shadows in the colonial archives, as well as conspicuous absences in the post-colonial ones. So I'm going to conclude there, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Chloe. There any questions from the audience? We're all a little bit shy, I think. I'll ask the first question then. About the maps, especially the maps like in the 1920s, 1930s, maybe it's changed or maybe it hasn't. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the naming convention. Are the maps? You allude to a little bit of distrust between different parties, Egyptians and then Brits. Were the names that appear on the maps, were the names indigenous names, or were they created names? Were they translated names? The English names?
Thank you. That's a great, I think that's a great question. I didn't have an example of this. Well, it would be hard to see the labels anyway, but I think we can get some insight into the names, the labels that were used from correspondence between the British mappers, and often their correspondents are the Geographical Society folks in London. That's the correspondence, at least, that I was able to access, talking about kind of these naming conventions and deciding which ones to use. So they offer a sort of genealogy of the knowledge that puts these together. So we see some interesting stories. I mean, often you find a mix of names. These maps that I showed today are all labeled entirely in Arabic, but that's not always the case. There are English copies, there are bilingual copies, etc. And in particular, the maps where there are labels in English, you notice that some of the names are Arabic and others are like clearly not. And in one letter I read between the president of the Geographical Society in London in this period, his name was Arthur Hinks, with John Ball, the Desert Survey director, he says he looks at these names. They're names like Pottery Hill and Regenfeld. And he says to John Ball, he says, you know, it's really a pity that you would use English names on this map. And then he follows that and he says, but can't you come up with some Arabic names for these places? You know, he says back when we were working on Tibet, we found on the Mount Everest map that you could just make up names that sounded Tibetan, and that worked pretty well. I mean, wouldn't that be nice? And John Ball says, well, you know, okay, yeah, Arabic names are preferable, but the maps are already printed out. But then he jokes about it and he says, you know, I can make up an Arabic name if you want for the massive Qattara Depression east of Siwa. He says, I would call it Hufrat Gehennem, you know, the hole of hell. You know, jesting aside, I mean, this was something that, you know, they were joking about amongst themselves, but the point was like, you could just invent Arabic translations of foreign language toponyms, you know, rather than identify what these places might already have been called by the people who lived there. And I think that provides some insight into the kind of, I don't know, dismissiveness, actually, even that many of the people, even who spent their entire career, felt about the places they were mapping.
In a certain amount of arrogance as well. That
arrogance, incredible, yeah, arrogance, yeah.
And, speaking of that, in like the naming convention, I wonder, you talk about it in your dissertation. I don't think you had a chance to talk about it today, but the Zerzura, I wonder if you could explain to our audience, like this, is it a mythical place or is it a real place?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that you know, one of the reasons, or one of the ways that the desert became such an object of fascination in the interwar period, and this was not only for Brits, or not only for foreigners, by the way. I mean, actually, there was quite a sort of desert, an increase in interest in the desert and its particular economic potential, but also it's in the interwar period for Egyptians, but also its allure. For those who were urbanites specifically, who didn't already live there. And Zerzura was one of these places that just became, that foreigners in particular became really fixated on as in this sort of heyday of desert exploration. These desert travelers in the 1920s were especially enthralled to lost oases. So not the oases like Kharga that on the last slide I showed, which are well known, Dakhla also well known, Farafra, etc. But ones that sort of they felt were yet to be discovered, which was theoretically they felt still possible because they hadn't really mapped to their degree of exactitude what was out there. And actually, it was Ahmed Hassanein, an Egyptian explorer, who became quite famous in Egypt in the interwar period for crossing the Western Desert with his cameras, Kodak cameras, and sort of romanticizing it. He was also an Olympic fencer, interestingly enough. But anyways, to come back to Zerzura, I mean, this was really the most tantalizing of these mystical oases. And people held out hope that within reach of Egypt, you know, there might be some forgotten cities rising from the sands. And I can pull up one particular quote about it. There was a British soldier, Ralph Banyol, who came to Egypt in 1925, and he said, you know, Zerzura could be a real place, but it's also a kind of stand-in for all that's yet unknown. You know, he says Zerzura is sought in many places, in the desert, at the poles, in the mountains of Asia. You know, but there's no fear that journey or that quest will end, even if the blank spaces on the map get smaller and smaller. So yeah, Zerzura was this constant. Basically, it was a stand-in. It could become anything. Even if all the oases were left to be discovered, there was still something out there, and that was Zerzura for these interwar explorers. And you may be familiar. In particular, one of the Zerzura seekers who's best known is Lasso Almasi, whose explorations, on whom the English patient is loosely based. So this was something that made it all the way into Cosmo, actually, in the United States, the search for Zerzura.